There's definitely some parallels to draw upon, but let me kind of put that in context. So the primary problem we had in 2007 to 2008 was that the China boom was huge. It was just gobbling up any resources they could. And American subprime was generating an artificial inflation of demand, if you will, in the United States. At the same time that the Iraq War was keeping oil off the market, and Venezuela was early in its national suicide. So we had oil prices between 100 and 150 for a prolonged period of time, which contributed to the financial crisis, obviously. You don't use oil to make fertilizer. And in a lot of places, natural gas is indexed to oil because a lot of times they're co-produced, but they are different commodities. So natural gas was drug up with oil because of that linkage in 2008, and that definitely contributed to a fertilizer problem. But even at its peak in the United States, natural gas never breached 7. Now, in the United States right now, courtesy of the shale revolution, we have a lot of excess natural gas that we've been gobbling up in the years since. We went to 6 at the end of last year. Right now, we're below 5 still. I don't think we're going to go above 7. But in Europe, because natural gas, because it's a gas, it's more difficult to transport. So you need a more dedicated pipeline system, or you have to bring it in via LNG, which is incredibly expensive. Before the war started, the Europeans were already experiencing shortage, which had already taken natural gas prices up to 30 compared to 6 in the United States. It's doubled since then. So we're talking about prices in Europe, at least, that are 7 times what they were in 2008 at the peak. And so it's not an issue of fertilizer is expensive. It's an issue of they're no longer making it because the base material is too costly. Well, the demographic situation was certainly pushing them to do it in the near term, but I asked as to why specifically, why February? It had to do with the combination of the Trump impeachment and the Biden administration's changing of arms export rules. So you may remember that the first impeachment trial for Donald Trump was about him trying to blackmail the Ukrainian president, the current guy, the guy who's like doing TikTok videos in downtown Ukraine when the bombs are falling, that guy. Tried to blackmail him into investigating Hunter Biden for him in order to get dirt on the Biden family for his reelection campaign. And as a result of that, he cut military aid to Ukraine substantially. The Russian thinking was if Trump wins re-election, that's the end of NATO and we'll just be able to swallow the place. Well, that didn't happen. Biden won. And one of the first things that Biden did was restart the military aid. And in November, if you remember, that's when the Russians started getting all squeaky and screamy about security issues in Europe. Well, November is when the Javelins met the frontline troops in the separatist provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk, and the Russians actually saw the impact of American military aid on their troops. That's when the buildup started. Okay. Well, the Russians see this as an issue of existential national survival, and I think they're reading the situation correctly. They know if they don't win in Ukraine and Poland and Romania and Latvia, that this is the end of Russia is inevitable, and probably before the mid-century point. They think that if they can plug those gaps, they buy themselves more time, and I think they're reading the situation correctly, which really does make it an us or them. There is not a version of a peace here that would satisfy both sides. The Russians like to say that, if you only gave us what we wanted on security, none of this would have ever happened. But remember, what they're asking for is the ability to either put troops in or decide the security policies of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Serbia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. I probably missed a couple. Anyway, they're saying that they need to be able to write the security policies for a combined population that is twice of theirs. That's asinine. So anyone who says that NATO forced the Russians into this is technically correct, but they're also stupid. There is no version of this. There is no off-ramp that Putin would accept because he knows, especially now, that if he fails, that's the end. And the only thing that would be worse than not launching the war would be launching it and failing. So he's not going to stop. Ukraine today is not the Ukraine that it was in 2013. If the Russians had done this in 2013, this war may well be over already. They didn't have a strong national identity, their military was weak, and there was a substantial percentage of the population that was overtly pro-Russian. That's not the case anymore. So now the Russians are looking to have to occupy a country that at the start of the war had 45 million people. That's going to take a couple million troops, and they only have a couple million troops. So from a conventional point of view, this is already the last war that the Russians will fight. When they move on to Romania, Poland, and the rest, it is a nuclear question, because that's the only way the Russians can get what they want. So if the Russians can pacify Ukraine and Moldova to their preference, they will then start explicitly threatening nuclear attacks across NATO in order to get what they want in those areas. And they will not be afraid to use nukes to do it, because from their point of view, the end is already nigh. So better to go out swinging and maybe possibly be able to intimidate countries into giving them what they want than not. And it's not as stupid as it sounds, because there are two pipelines that take natural gas under the Baltic Sea and under the Black Sea direct to Germany and Turkey. And without Germany and Turkey, there is no NATO function in this area. So we're getting very close to the point that energy is going to be disrupted, that the Germans and the Turks can be offered a deal, that the Russians can keep their lights on and only their lights on, but only if they abandon NATO. I don't know how the Germans and the Turks are going to respond to that, but that's probably the next chapter of this, which makes it absolutely beyond critical that Russia never sufficiently pacify Ukraine so that they feel they can move on. This is where, from the West point of view, this has to end. Now, the Ukrainians have to do the fighting. We can provide them with all the equipment and intelligence and targeting information that we can. But if we have American soldiers in Ukraine, the Russians will know, and then it's a different sort of field. If we put fighter jets or start doing a no-fly zone, same thing. The Russians will feel they have no choice but to escalate. So this has to remain conventional, and it has to remain in Ukraine. Anything else, you are talking about mushroom clouds. Well, let's start with the Indians, because it's a simpler situation. India never joined the global order. They were definitely pro-Soviet. And even when the Soviet Union died, they continued to be pro-Soviet. There's a degree of ideological catch-up that the Indians have not yet done, and they've barely started, actually. And so when they look at this situation, they see Russia as Soviet, even though they're not, even though the Russians can't give them any of the money or most of the weapons that in the past they thought were viable. We're certainly seeing on the battlefield that Russian weapons are not nearly as useful in a real war as we thought they were. So whenever you see, or aside from that, geographically, the Indians are absolutely trapped in South Asia. Even if Pakistan wasn't there, there's still deserts and mountains that hem them in. So India is incapable of projecting economic and political power into Europe in a way that would allow them to establish an independent trade link. They can only trade with Russia if the Europeans and the Americans allow it. And I think in April that is going to stop. And the Indians will absolutely bitch, but there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. Also, the damage is done already in terms of the agricultural situation. So they're going to be obsessing about that issue here fairly soon. So that's India. China, whew. Okay, so China joined the global order with Mao. That was the whole point of the Nixon-Mao summit, that we would bring the Chinese into the system if they would turn their back on the Soviets, and it worked. And that contributed to the end of the Cold War without a shot being fired. Big victory for both sides. Both sides being the US and China, not the Russians, obviously.